but I'm afraid I cannot bring myself to trust the SNP with Scotland's education, let alone reforming Scotland's education, because for as long as vested interests have an automatic veto over change in Scottish education, as they do now, we will be stuck with the same problems. The SNP government can't and won't take on the establishment conventional wisdom. They can't and won't stand up for the best interests of teachers or parents or young people. They're afraid to upset the liberal consensus in our education system. They won't go near the presumption of mainstreaming for children with additional support needs who are often horribly failed. They won't go near dealing with the breakdown of discipline in our schools, which has seen a horrific rise in the number of violent incidents occurring in schools, 45,000 last year alone. And last week, we saw the Cabinet Secretary backing off on teacher numbers and permanent contracts, claiming that a deal was in place with COSLA only for it to unravel within hours. The SNP's education reform agenda is a dishonest chimera. Let's start with Qualifications Scotland. In the words of the SQA itself, the bill, quote, creates a new organisation that has the same functions, not just in broad terms, but in quite specific terms as the existing organisation, unquote. It's a name change, nothing more. At the core of the SNP's own Muir review was the sensible proposal that there should be a separation between the SQA's accreditation and awarding functions. Professor Muir, who I have always found to be eminently reasonable, argued on the basis of experience and evidence that without the separation of functions, the SQA was in effect, quote, marking its own homework, unquote. But the Cabinet Secretary and the bright sparks in her team have decided to set aside these findings. Yet another example, I'm afraid, of a clapped-out government with no appetite to reform the education system because they are enthralled to too many vested interests.
Martin Whitfield, briefly.
Very glad for the moment to take an intervention. Would you agree with me that I struggle to see the evidence that actually they understand why the separation is so important?
Stephen Kerr.
I would agree with that, because on the basis of all the evidence presented, the evidence suggests a clear case. But we have a government that is enthralled to vested interests. The cluttered landscape, as the OECD described it in its 2021 report, of all these different groups competing for attention, competing for their space. And we have seen the Cabinet Secretary, like her predecessors, not daring to take on these interest groups. Remember John Swinney's flagship education reform bill? It fell at exactly the same hurdle. And so I support the conclusions of the Education, Children and Young People Committee report on stage 1, that the accreditation functions should sit separately from Qualifications Scotland. If, as the committee notes, this bill is intended to attract the confidence expected or hoped for in a national qualifications body, then the bill is clearly failing in this objective. Elsewhere in its report, the committee states that culture change is not a product of legislation. It's been quoted already. I completely agree. Culture change is a product of leadership, and I am pessimistic about culture change inside a renamed failing SQA run by the same people who have been unable to deliver culture change previously. Now I want to say something about the proposal to establish an independent office of His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education in Scotland. The Scottish Conservatives have long argued for this, and we have not been alone in repeatedly pointing out how inadequate the regime of inspection is. The Inspectorate should report to this Parliament, as Audit Scotland does. The critical appointment which will determine the success or otherwise of this significant change, which I welcome, will be that of the Chief Inspector. And I return to the point that I made a few moments ago about the importance of setting the right organisational culture, and that will be down to the leadership of the Chief Inspector. The fact that the bill is opaque when it comes to describing the purpose of inspections is itself very unhelpful, a point made by the committee in its report. The level of resource to be made available to the new inspectorate and the scope of its functional operations is also unclear, and that is not satisfactory, even at stage 1. And finally, I turn to Education Scotland. As the NASUWT made clear to the committee, Education Scotland has lost the trust and confidence of teachers. The bill does not change this. The bill doesn't come anywhere near it. So I quote Professor Mark Priestley of Stirling University. He told the committee, quote, "Currently, we have lots of issues with agencies that have overlapping functions and a lack of clarity about functioning. There are demarcation issues and boundary issues. There are agencies that do operational and strategic stuff that also evaluate their own work. So there are conflicts of interest. The system is set up to justify itself and to celebrate its success, rather than take a critical look at what happens, and that is seen very clearly by practitioners working on the ground." I'd say that Professor Priestley hits the bullseye. So I back the committee's request that the Scottish Government set out its full intentions on education. Scotland, the Cabinet Secretary may recall, in previous private conversations with her, I have made it very clear that if we cannot find the purpose for Education Scotland and the value it adds, then we ought to do away with it. This bill is clearly inadequate, Presiding Officer.
Thank you.
And that's
I now call Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by John Mason. Up to 6 minutes, Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.